In this short video, we'll talk about the two sensory receptors that are used with skeletal muscle to tell the brain what the skeletal muscles are doing so the brain can better control them. So the two sensory receptors that are used with skeletal muscle are the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs. The muscle spindles detect muscle length, and the Golgi tendon organs detect muscle tension. Here's a picture of a muscle spindle. It's embedded inside the skeletal muscle, and it's composed of some specialized muscle cells, and wrapped around them you have the endings of a sensory neuron. Muscle spindle responds to changes in muscle length. So when the muscle is relaxed, it sends a medium frequency of action potentials to the brain. But when the skeletal muscle contracts, then the muscle spindle sends fewer action potentials to the brain. And if the skeletal muscle is stretched, then it sends a lot of action potentials to the brain. So the brain can tell the length of the muscle just by looking at the frequency of action potentials coming in from the muscle spindles. And if you remember from chapter 10 that the muscle spindles are one of the types of proprioceptors. And remember, proprioceptors are going to tell the brain the position of the limbs. So by being able to tell if the muscle is contracted or relaxed, then you can get a good idea of what position your limb is in. The other thing we talked about in chapter 10 with the sensory receptors is we said that they could either be tonic or phasic receptors. So which type of receptor is the muscle spindle? So remember, muscle spindles are an example of a tonic receptor. Remember that tonic receptors are always sending action potentials to the brain. They adapt very slowly to the stimulus, and so they're always going to be telling the brain, for example, in this case, what the position of the limbs are. Also, spindles are involved in the patellar or knee jerk reflex. So they will detect the length of the quadriceps muscle. So when the patellar tendon is hit, it will stretch the quadriceps, and then the sensory neuron will then send a signal to the spinal cord and cause the knee jerk reflex. The other type of sensory receptor involved in skeletal muscles are the Golgi tendon organs, and they detect muscle tension. So these sensory nerve endings are embedded right in the tendon. When the muscle contracts and shortens and then starts pulling on the tendon, that will squeeze the endings of the Golgi tendon organs, and then they will send action potentials up to the spinal cord and then to the brain. And that will tell the brain how much force or tension is being generated by that muscle when it contracts. The Golgi tendon organs are involved in a reflex called the tendon reflex, which if you've ever watched weightlifters lifting really heavy weights, if you've ever seen them where their arm or their leg just all of a sudden gives out and they collapse, that's the tendon reflex. The tendon reflex is protective. It helps protect the tendon from being ripped off the bone and prevents the muscle from generating too much force. So if the muscle starts to contract too hard, the Golgi tendon organs will send a signal up to the spinal cord, which will then inhibit the motor neuron to the skeletal muscle, and that will shut off the skeletal muscle contraction, the muscle relaxes, and then the weightlifter's arm or leg will then collapse.